There I was, standing in my driveway with a block of sandpaper in one hand and a mug of lukewarm coffee in the other, watching count them, police cruisers screech around the corner of the cul-de-sac like they were responding to a bank heist in progress, and the funny thing is, the only crime being committed was the sheer audacity of the woman standing at the end of my driveway pointing a manicured finger at my chest like it was a loaded weapon. Blue and red lights were dancing off the wet pavement of Cedar Creek, bouncing off the hull of the 1955 Chris Craft boat I was restoring, and illuminating the face of Patricia Vance, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, who looked like she was about to vibrate out of her skin with righteous indignation, screaming something about toxic fumes and illegal industrial manufacturing, to a 911 operator who was probably regretting their career choices. Now, before we get to the handcuffs and the federal indictments, you have to understand why a guy like me, someone who spent 30 years burying secrets for the CIA as a forensic financial auditor, ended up in a place like Whispering Pines, a neighborhood so manicured it looked like it was designed by a committee of robots who'd never actually seen a tree in real life but had read a detailed description of one. I moved here to disappear, plain and simple. After 3 decades of chasing money trails through shell companies in the Caymans and shadowy non-profits in Eastern Europe, I just wanted quiet. I wanted the smell of rain, the sound of a sander smoothing out old mahogany, and absolutely zero drama, which is exactly why I bought the corner lot with the big garage and the privacy hedges that were allegedly compliant with Section 4, Paragraph B of the community bylaws. But folks like Patricia, or Patty, as she insisted, though there was nothing friendly about it, don't believe in privacy, they believe in control, and for Patty, the HOA wasn't a volunteer organization, it was a fiefdom, and she was the feudal lord collecting taxes in the form of dignity. She showed up on my second day, holding a binder that was thicker than the tax code, wearing a pastel yellow blazer that was aggressively cheerful, and told me that my mailbox was leaning 3 degrees to the left, which, according to her, suggested a lack of moral fortitude. I should have known then that this wasn't going to be a peaceful retirement, but I just smiled, fixed the mailbox, and went back to my boat, thinking that if I just played by the rules, the predator would lose interest and move on to weaker prey. I was wrong, because predators like Patty don't hunt for food, they hunt for sport, and my vintage boat restoration project became her obsession. She'd walk by with her little Shih Tzu, pausing just long enough to scribble in a notepad, and the next day I'd get a fine for unauthorized structure visible from street, or excessive noise, even though I was hand sanding the hull, which makes less noise than a stiff breeze. It became a game, a daily duel where I would comply with malicious precision. She said the tarp was the wrong shade of blue, so I bought the exact Pantone code listed in the bylaws. She said I couldn't work past 6 p.m., so I stopped at 5:59 p.m. on the dot, holding eye contact with her while I shut the garage door. But the thing about bullies is that they hate compliance almost as much as they hate defiance because it robs them of the conflict they crave. The explosion happened on a Tuesday, a gray, drizzly afternoon typical of the Pacific Northwest, when I decided to apply the varnish, a task that requires ventilation, so I had the garage door open about 2 feet from the ground to let the air cycle through while keeping the rain out. I was deep in the zone, that meditative state where the world narrows down to the grain of the wood and the smell of linseed oil, when I heard the distinct click-clack of sensible heels on my driveway, followed by a voice that could strip paint. "Mr. Thorne," she barked, "we have received complaints about chemical warfare," which was a bit of a stretch for marine varnish, but Patty lived in a world of hyperboles. I slid out from under the hull on my creeper, looked up at her, and said, "Patty, it's varnish, not sarin gas, take a breath, you might actually like the smell of hard work." That was the mistake, never insult a tyrant's sense of smell, because her eyes went wide, her lips thinned into a razor wire, and she pulled out her phone, hitting a speed dial that I suspect she had saved as the manager, but was actually emergency services. She told them there was a man barricaded in a garage with explosive chemicals, and that he was acting belligerent and possibly unstable, fabricating a narrative in real time with the ease of a seasoned sociopath, and I just sat there on my creeper, wiping my hands on a rag, watching her performance with a mix of awe and pity, thinking about how sad a life must be that this is what constitutes a thrill. When the police arrived, Officer Miller, a young guy who looked like he was 12, and Sergeant Graves, a veteran who looked like he was tired of everything, they approached with hands on their holsters because, thanks to Patty, they thought they were walking into a Breaking Bad situation. "Sir, step out of the garage with your hands visible," Graves called out, voice tight, and I did, moving slowly, holding my coffee mug like a peace offering. Patty was behind the squad car, shouting, "Check the drums." "He has drums of chemicals," referencing the 2 one-gallon cans of varnish sitting on my workbench. Graves walked up, sniffed the air, looked at the beautiful mahogany hull of the boat, looked at the cans, and then looked at me with a recognition that dawned slowly, not because he knew me, but because he knew the type. "It's a boat restoration, Sergeant," I said calmly, offering my ID. "I'm restoring a 55 Chris Craft. The chemicals are high-grade marine finish, totally legal, totally standard." Graves looked at my license, then ran a quick check, and while he didn't know I was agency, the background check probably flashed a few flags that said, "Do not detain without cause," so his demeanor shifted from tense to apologetic. He turned to Patty and said, "Ma'am," but here is where the story shifts, where it stops being a funny anecdote about a crazy neighbor and starts being a tragedy for her, because as the cops were leaving, Patty walked up to me, her face splotchy with rage, and hissed, "You think you're untouchable because you have a little hobby, but I run this neighborhood, Mr. Thorne, and I will dig until I find whatever dirty little secret you're hiding, and then I will evict you." She didn't know it, but she had just threatened a man who made a career out of finding dirty little secrets, a man who had toppled regimes by looking at their bank statements, and as she stomped away, I didn't feel angry, I felt a familiar, cold itch in the back of my brain, the itch of an audit coming on. I went inside, poured the rest of my coffee down the sink, and opened my laptop, not the personal one I used for Netflix, but the encrypted beast I kept in the floor safe, the one with the software that could peel back layers of digital skin, and I started typing. See, people like Patty, people who are obsessed with the rules, usually love them because they know how to bend them. They use bureaucracy as a shield, but every shield has a weight, and every tyrant leaves a paper trail. I started with the public records, the HOA filings for Whispering Pines, pulling the last 5 years of financial reports which were, on the surface, impeccable, formatted perfectly, every font aligned, every column balanced, too balanced. In the world of forensic accounting, chaos is natural, real numbers are messy, expenses vary, budgets drift, but Patty's books were mathematically perfect, creating a symmetry that doesn't exist in the real world, like a face that's been photoshopped until it looks like a mask. I dug deeper, looking at the vendors, the companies that the HOA paid for landscaping, pool maintenance, security, and legal fees, and that's when I saw it, a recurring payment to a company called Verdantscapes LLC for seasonal arboreal maintenance, totaling nearly $80,000 over 3 years. Now, Whispering Pines has trees, sure, but $80,000 for trimming branches seemed steep, so I ran a search on Verdantscapes LLC and found their registered address was a P.O. box in a strip mall 3 towns over, a strip mall that, according to satellite imagery, housed a vape shop and a defunct Blockbuster, not a landscaping firm. I felt the adrenaline kick in, that specific, gotcha, dopamine hit that is better than any drug, and I kept pulling the thread, tracing the ownership of Verdantscapes, which led to a holding company in Delaware, which led back to a bank account in our very own county, registered to a man named David Vance, Patty's brother, a man who, according to his social media, had been unemployed for 6 years but somehow posted photos from a yacht in the Mediterranean last summer. It wasn't just embezzlement, it was a kickback scheme, clunky and arrogant, built on the assumption that no one would ever look, that the neighbors were too afraid of Patty to ask for receipts, and that she was the smartest person in the room, but she wasn't the smartest, she was just the loudest. The next morning, I didn't go out to the garage, I put on a suit, my old charcoal gray suit that still smelled faintly of DC humidity and intimidation, and I walked down to the community clubhouse where the monthly HOA board meeting was scheduled to start in 20 minutes. The room was packed, mostly because Patty had called an emergency session to discuss the safety hazard on the corner lot, meaning me and my boat. She was standing at the podium, gavel in hand, looking like a captain steering a ship into an iceberg, unaware that the torpedo was already in the water, and when I walked in, the room went silent, the kind of silence that happens when the defendant walks into the courtroom and sits in the judge's chair. I sat in the back row, placing a single manila folder on the empty chair next to me, and watched as Patty launched into her tirade, projecting photos of my garage onto a screen, circling the varnish cans in red digital ink, her voice rising in a crescendo of fabricated victimhood. "We cannot allow our property values to be decimated by industrial squalor," she shouted, and the neighbors nodded nervously, terrified that if they didn't agree, their own trash cans would be inspected next. But I just waited, checking my watch, waiting for the Q&A session, waiting for the moment the trap would snap shut. When Patty finally paused for breath, asking if there were any comments from the floor, I stood up slowly, not with aggression, but with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a glacier, and the squeak of my chair against the linoleum floor sounded like a gunshot in that silent room. "Madam President," I said, my voice projecting easily without shouting, a trick you learn when briefing heavy hitters who don't like loud noises, "before we vote on the issue of my varnish, I think we should discuss the issue of the trees." Patty squinted at me, confused by the pivot, her hand tightening around the gavel like she wanted to throw it. "Mr. Thorne, this meeting is about your violations, not landscaping," she snapped, checking her watch as if dismissing me, but I was already walking down the center aisle, holding the folder. "Actually, Patty, it's about value," I continued, reaching the front row where the treasurer, a terrified-looking man named Jerry, was sweating through his polo shirt. "See, I was looking at the budget you sent out, specifically the $82,000 paid to Verdantscapes LLC for tree trimming." I paused, turning to face the room, letting the number hang in the air like smoke. "Now, I've walked this neighborhood every morning, and I haven't seen a professional tree crew in 2 years, just Jerry here with a pole saw he bought at Home Depot." A murmur rippled through the crowd, eyes darting between me and Jerry, who looked like he might faint, while Patty's face went from flush to a pale, waxen white. "That is privileged administrative information," she shrieked, banging the gavel so hard the head actually flew off and skittered across the floor, a poetic metaphor for her losing control. "You have no right to audit our vendors. You are out of order." But I wasn't speaking to her anymore, I was speaking to the room, to the people she had bullied for years. "I pulled the incorporation papers for Verdantscapes," I said, pulling a document from the folder and holding it up. "It's a shell company, Patty, registered to your brother, David Vance, and the bank records, which are surprisingly easy to cross-reference when you use the same routing number for the HOA dues, show that within 24 hours of every check clearing to Verdant, a transfer is made to a personal account in your name." The room erupted, not with shouting, but with the gasps of 30 people simultaneously realizing they'd been robbed by the woman who measured their grass with a ruler. Patty tried to shout over them, screaming about lawsuits, about slander, about how I was a government plant, which was ironically close to the truth, but the spell was broken. I walked over to the projector, unplugged her laptop, and plugged in a flash drive I had in my pocket, bringing up a simple, devastating spreadsheet, date in, date out, the Vance Family Vacation Fund. "This is grand larceny, Patty," I said softly, only for her to hear. "And wire fraud, and tax evasion, and since you used the U.S. mail to send the invoices, mail fraud too, that's the one that really gets you the years." She froze, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally, but finding only neighbors who were suddenly remembering every unfair fine, every condescending note, every dollar they had paid into a fund that bought her brother a Mediterranean cruise. She looked at me, and for the first time, the mask of the officious bureaucrat slipped, revealing a scared, greedy child underneath. "I just wanted the neighborhood to be nice," she whispered, a delusional justification for theft, and I almost felt sorry for her, almost. "No, Patty," I replied, "you wanted it to be yours." The police arrived 10 minutes later, Sergeant Graves again, who looked at me, looked at the spreadsheet still projected on the wall, and just shook his head with a weary smile. They didn't handcuff her in front of everyone, they were professional about it, asking her to step outside, but the walk from the podium to the exit was the longest mile of her life, a gauntlet of silent stares from the people she had terrorized. As she passed me, she didn't threaten me this time, she didn't say a word, she just stared at her feet, the queen of whispering pines dethroned by a man who just wanted to sand his boat in peace. The fallout was messy, as these things always are. The HOA accounts were frozen, Jerry the treasurer turned state's witness faster than you can say, plea deal, and it turned out Patty had siphoned nearly 200 grand over 5 years. The neighborhood didn't collapse into anarchy without her iron fist. In fact, the opposite happened. People started painting their shutters colors that weren't on the approved beige spectrum, kids played in the street again, and the silence that fell over Whispering Pines wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of peace. I finished the Chris Craft 6 months later, launching it on the lake on a crisp autumn morning, the engine purring with that deep, throaty rumble that only vintage engines have. As I steered it out toward the center of the water, looking back at the shoreline, I thought about the nature of power, how some people hoard it like gold, terrified that someone will steal it, not realizing that real power is having the ability to destroy someone and choosing not to, right up until the moment they leave you no choice. Patty is currently serving 3 to 5 in a minimum security facility where, rumor has it, she's already trying to organize the inmates to standardize the way they fold their laundry, proving that you can take the Karen out of the HOA, but you can't take the HOA out of the Karen. And me? I'm still the guy on the corner lot. I still drink my coffee in the driveway, but now, when the neighbors walk by, they wave, a real wave, not a forced acknowledgement of compliance. I never told them what I used to do for a living, I never told them about the agency or the audits or the bodies buried in spreadsheets. To them, I'm just Elias, the guy who likes old boats and who, for one glorious afternoon, stood up to the dragon and won. But it makes you think, doesn't it? We all have a Patty in our lives, someone who uses rules as a weapon, who thrives on making the world a little smaller, a little grayer. And we usually let them win because it's easier, because we don't want the hassle, because we think it doesn't matter. But it does matter. The line between order and tyranny is thinner than a coat of varnish, and sometimes, you have to be the one to sand it down.